There comes a moment when familiar words stop sounding safe, when something you have heard countless times suddenly presses against your soul with weight and authority. Two simple words, spoken plainly without explanation, begin to unsettle everything you thought you understood. I am. Not a suggestion, not a symbol, not a comforting phrase meant to soften reality, a declaration that refuses to be ignored. A statement that does not ask for agreement yet demands a response. I am is not rooted in time. It does not depend on context or circumstance. It does not wait for permission or validation. It stands complete, self-sustaining and unshaken. When Jesus declared I am, he was not merely identifying himself, he was revealing a truth so vast that language itself strains to contain it. This was not an introduction, it was a collision between eternity and human understanding. At first, the words may seem familiar, even ordinary. They can sound poetic, symbolic, or theological. But when their meaning finally breaks through, familiarity dissolves. These words do not sit quietly in the mind, they confront the heart. They dismantle assumptions. They expose the fragile foundations on which many lives are built. Because I am does not coexist comfortably with half-truths or borrowed beliefs. It challenges every false source of security and every illusion of control. I am declares absolute being. It announces existence without origin and presence without limitation. It speaks of a reality that does not fluctuate with circumstances or bow to human weakness. This declaration does not describe what God does. It reveals who God is, unchanging, ever-present, complete. And when that truth begins to sink in, something deep within begins to shift. The human heart is constantly searching for stability. It looks for meaning in achievement, identity in approval, and security in control. But all of these foundations eventually crack. Success fades, approval changes, control proves fragile. The declaration I am confronts this restless searching with a sobering truth. Everything built on anything other than the eternal will eventually fail. And yet within that confrontation lies an unexpected invitation. I am does not merely expose instability, it offers grounding. It reveals a presence that does not come and go, a truth that does not adjust to culture or convenience. This is not a distant concept or an abstract idea. It is presence itself, present in every moment, every uncertainty, every unanswered question. When this reality is grasped, belief is no longer theoretical. It becomes personal, immediate, alive. There is something unsettling about encountering a truth that does not bend. I am leaves no room for negotiation. It does not conform to expectations or soften itself to human comfort. And yet, paradoxically, it is within this unyielding truth that genuine peace begins. Not the kind of peace that depends on conditions, but the kind that flows from knowing that reality itself is anchored in something unshakable. Understanding I am also reveals a deeper tension. If God simply is, then everything else is not self-sustaining. Human strength, wisdom, and certainty are exposed as temporary. This realization can feel unsettling at first, even threatening. But it is precisely here that transformation begins. Because when illusions collapse, truth has room to take root. I am redefines power. It is not forceful, yet nothing resists it. It does not strive, yet nothing escapes it. It exists beyond effort and beyond exhaustion. And when this truth is truly seen, it begins to realign the heart. Life no longer revolves around proving worth or securing significance. Instead, it begins to orbit around presence, trust, and surrender. These two words are not meant to be observed from a distance. They invite reflection, confrontation, and ultimately, change. They ask a silent but piercing question. What happens when the eternal steps into teak? He center of your understanding. The answer is never small. Because when I am is no longer just heard but understood, it does not simply inform belief, it transforms the inner world. This is where the shift begins, not outwardly at first, but deep within, where fear starts to loosen its grip, where identity begins to untangle from performance, where faith stops being inherited language and becomes lived reality. The moment I am moves from concept to conviction is the moment everything else begins to change. When the meaning of I am truly settles in, the first internal shift happens quietly but decisively. Identity begins to stabilize. Not because circumstances improve or struggles disappear, but because the source of identity changes. What once depended on performance, validation, or comparison begins to loosen its grip. The constant pressure to define oneself starts to fade, replaced by something deeper and far more secure. For much of life, identity is shaped by external measures. Achievement becomes proof of worth. Failure becomes a verdict. Approval becomes oxygen. Rejection becomes a wound that lingers. In this fragile system, identity is always at risk. It rises and falls with opinions, outcomes, and expectations. But the declaration "I am" disrupts this cycle at its core. If God simply is, then worth does not originate from effort. It does not fluctuate with success or diminish with weakness. It is not granted by others nor revoked by failure. Understanding "I am" reveals that identity was never meant to be manufactured. It was meant to be received. And that realization changes everything. Fragile identity constantly asks questions that never find rest. Am I enough? Am I seen? Am I valuable? But when identity is anchored to the eternal, these questions lose their urgency. They no longer demand answers from unstable sources. The need to prove, perform, or impress begins to weaken because the foundation has shifted from self to presence. "I am" does not define worth by productivity or perfection. It reveals a truth that stands apart from human evaluation. When this truth is grasped, identity becomes rooted rather than reactive. It no longer bends under pressure or shatters under criticism. Confidence stops being loud and defensive. It becomes quiet and steady. This shift does not eliminate humility. It deepens it, because understanding "I am" exposes both human limitation and divine sufficiency. There is freedom in no longer pretending to be self-sustaining. There is peace in recognizing that identity does not depend on being strong all the time. Weakness no longer threatens value. It becomes a place where dependence is allowed. A fragile identity constantly seeks control. It fears exposure and avoids stillness. But when identity is grounded in the unchanging, control loosens its hold. The fear of being misunderstood, overlooked, or replaced begins to fade. Not because those things no longer happen, but because they no longer define reality. "I am" also confronts the false labels that accumulate over time. Labels shaped by past mistakes. Labels imposed by others. Labels internalized through shame or disappointment. When eternal presence becomes the reference point, these labels lose their authority. They are revealed as incomplete, temporary, and powerless to define what God has already established. Identity anchored in "I am" is not inflated, but it is secure. It does not require constant reinforcement. It does not collapse under correction. It does not depend on comparison to feel valuable. There is a steadiness that emerges, a sense of being held rather than striving, known rather than performing. This transformation is subtle but profound. It does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself through peace under pressure, clarity in confusion, and resilience in moments that once caused collapse. Identity becomes something lived rather than defended. There is less need to explain, justify, or prove. When "I am" becomes central, self-definition stops being the driving force of life. Instead, identity flows from relationship, presence, and truth. The inner world grows quieter, not because questions disappear, but because they no longer threaten the core. The soul learns where it belongs. This is the power of understanding "I am." It replaces fragile identity with grounded belonging. It moves the heart from striving to resting, from insecurity to assurance. And once identity is no longer fragile, everything else begins to align around that stability. Fear survives on uncertainty. It grows wherever outcomes are unclear and control feels threatened. It speaks in questions that never rest and warnings that never fully explain themselves. It convinces the mind that danger is always closer than safety and that peace must be postponed until conditions improve. But the declaration "I am" enters this inner chaos with a truth fear cannot manipulate. "I am" speaks of presence without interruption, not past, not future, but now. Not conditional, not occasional, but constant. When this reality is truly grasped, fear begins to lose its strongest weapon, the belief that you are alone in uncertainty. Presence changes everything. Fear may still whisper, but it no longer commands. Before understanding "I am," fear often defines decision-making. Choices are filtered through worst-case scenarios. Silence becomes threatening. Waiting feels unbearable. The unknown is treated as an enemy. But when eternal presence becomes central, the unknown loses its power to intimidate. It remains unknown, but it is no longer empty. Fear thrives on imagined absence. It assumes that if clarity has not arrived, abandonment must have. But "I am" declares the opposite. It reveals that presence does not depend on understanding. Even when answers are delayed, presence remains. This truth slowly dismantles fear's authority, not through denial but through assurance. There is a difference between caution and fear. Fear exaggerates danger and minimizes strength. It focuses attention on what might go wrong while ignoring what remains unshaken. But when I am becomes the foundation, perception shifts. Challenges are still acknowledged, but they are no longer magnified beyond proportion. Fear stops defining reality. Understanding I am does not eliminate vulnerability, it reframes it. Vulnerability no longer means exposure without support. It becomes openness held within presence. The heart learns that uncertainty does not equal danger and that waiting does not equal loss. This realization quiets the inner noise that fear depends on. Fear also feeds on time, regret over what is past, and anxiety over what may come. But I am exists outside this tension. It anchors awareness in the present where fear has the least control. When attention returns to presence, fear finds less room to operate. The mind becomes steadier, less reactive, more grounded. As fear loses authority, courage does not appear as recklessness. It emerges as steadiness. Decisions become less hurried and more intentional. There is a growing ability to move forward without needing guarantees. Confidence shifts from outcomes to trust. Strength no longer comes from certainty but from reliance on something greater than circumstance. I am also exposes fear's false promises. Fear claims to protect, but it ultimately confines. It promises safety but delivers limitation. When its authority is challenged by truth, the heart begins to recognize how much life has been shaped by avoidance rather than faith. This awareness becomes an invitation to live differently. Peace begins to replace panic, not suddenly but consistently. The inner world grows quieter. Thoughts become less frantic. The body learns to rest even when questions remain unanswered. Fear is no longer the default response to uncertainty. Trust begins to take its place. This transformation does not remove difficulty. It removes domination. Fear may still appear, but it no longer dictates direction. It becomes a signal rather than a ruler. The heart learns to acknowledge fear without surrendering to it. When I am is truly understood, fear is no longer the loudest voice. Presence becomes greater than panic. Truth becomes stronger than imagination. And in that shift, life opens up, not because it is risk-free, but because it is no longer ruled by fear. There is a moment when faith stops being inherited language and starts becoming lived reality. It no longer exists as something borrowed from tradition, culture, or repetition. Understanding I am initiates this shift. Faith moves from the surface of belief into the center of experience. It becomes less about what is known and more about who is trusted. Before this understanding, faith often functions as agreement with ideas, doctrines, or principles. It may be sincere, even passionate, but it remains distant. It can be recited without being relied upon. But I am does not allow faith to remain impersonal. Presence demands relationship. Truth demands response. I am reveals a God who is not merely spoken about, but encountered. Not confined to explanations or reduced to concepts. This realization changes the posture of belief. Faith stops being a system to manage uncertainty and becomes a connection that sustains through it. It no longer depends on perfect understanding. It rests in trust. When faith becomes personal, questions do not disappear, but they lose their power to destabilize. Doubt no longer feels like failure. It becomes part of a living relationship rather than a threat to it. There is room for wrestling without fear of rejection. Faith grows stronger not by suppressing questions, but by holding them in the presence of I am. Personal faith is not loud or performative. It does not need constant validation. It grows quietly through trust built over time. There is a shift from proving belief to living it. Actions begin to align with conviction not because of obligation, but because trust reshapes desire. I am also removes the pressure to manufacture faith. There is no need to force certainty or pretend confidence. Faith becomes honest. It acknowledges weakness without shame and strength without pride. It accepts dependence not as failure but as the natural response to divine sufficiency. This kind of faith reshapes prayer, reflection, and obedience. They stop being routines and become expressions of relationship. Faith is no longer something turned to only in crisis. It becomes the framework through which life is understood. Presence is no longer sought occasionally, it is recognized continually. As faith becomes personal, comparison loses its influence. There is no need to measure belief against others. The focus shifts inward, not toward self-reliance, but toward intimacy with truth. Faith becomes less about being seen and more about being aligned. I am also transforms trust in outcomes. Faith stops demanding guarantees. It becomes willing to move forward without full visibility. Confidence shifts from circumstances to presence. This does not eliminate caution or wisdom, it deepens them. Decisions are guided by conviction rather than fear. There is a growing awareness that faith is not something possessed, it is something lived. It shapes perception, influences response, and anchors the heart. The inner world becomes steadier, not because life becomes predictable, but because trust has found its foundation. When faith becomes personal, it stops being confined to moments of worship or reflection. It begins to influence every thought, every choice, every response. It becomes integrated rather than compartmentalized. Belief in life no longer operates separately. This transformation is subtle but unmistakable. Faith gains depth, not drama. It becomes resilient, not rigid. It remains open, not fragile. And all of this flows from one central truth: when I am is truly understood, faith is no longer distant. It becomes personal, present, and alive. Surrender is often misunderstood as weakness, as though releasing control means forfeiting strength or dignity. It is commonly associated with defeat, resignation, or giving up. But when the meaning of I am is truly grasped, surrender is redefined from the inside out. It no longer feels like loss. It begins to feel like alignment. Before this understanding, control feels necessary for survival. Plans become protection. Certainty becomes security. Letting go feels dangerous because it threatens the illusion of self-sufficiency. But I am exposes that illusion gently yet firmly. If God simply is, then control was never truly in human hands to begin with. Surrender in this light is not the abandonment of responsibility. It is the release of false authority. It is the recognition that striving to carry what was never meant to be carried only leads to exhaustion. When presence becomes the foundation, effort no longer needs to prove worth or guarantee outcomes. Life shifts from force to flow. I am reveals a reality that does not require constant management. This truth confronts the deep fear that if control is loosened, everything will collapse. But what begins to emerge instead is trust. Trust that presence holds what effort could never secure. Trust that guidance does not depend on anxiety. Trust that rest is not negligence but wisdom. As surrender becomes clearer, resistance softens. There is less need to fight every uncertainty or predict every outcome. The inner tension that once accompanied decision-making begins to ease, not because choices become easier, but because they are no longer driven by fear of losing control. Surrender also exposes how much energy has been spent maintaining appearances, defending identity, and protecting imagined outcomes. When I am becomes central, these efforts start to feel unnecessary. The heart begins to recognize that it was never designed to be the source. It was designed to respond. This shift does not remove discipline or intention. It purifies them. Actions are no longer fueled by anxiety or obligation, but by trust and clarity. There is a growing willingness to obey without fully understanding and to move forward without guarantees. Surrender becomes an act of confidence rather than desperation. I am also redefines success. It shifts focus from achieving control to remaining faithful, from forcing results to trusting process, from gripping tightly to opening hands. What once felt like loss begins to feel like relief. The weight of self-dependence lifts, replaced by a quiet assurance. As surrender deepens, resistance to vulnerability begins to fade. There is less fear of appearing weak, uncertain, or unfinished. Vulnerability is no longer a liability. It becomes a space where presence is experienced more deeply. Dependence stops being shameful and becomes natural. The fear that surrender will lead to insignificance also dissolves. Identity has already been secured. Worth has already been established. There is nothing left to prove. In this freedom, surrender becomes an ongoing posture rather than a single decision. A way of living rooted in trust rather than control. When I am is truly understood, surrender no longer feels like stepping backward. It feels like stepping into truth. It aligns the heart with reality instead of fighting against it. And in that alignment, peace begins to replace striving. This is the paradox of surrender. What once felt like loss becomes the doorway to freedom. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from fear. Not freedom from effort, but freedom from exhaustion. And it all flows from trusting the one who simply is. Purpose often feels elusive because it is treated as something to be discovered, achieved, or proven. It becomes tied to outcomes, roles, or recognition. When these shift, purpose feels unstable. But when the truth of I am becomes central, purpose undergoes a profound realignment. It stops being driven by pressure and begins to rest in presence. Before this understanding, purpose can feel urgent and heavy. There is a constant sense of needing to do more, become more, or accomplish something meaningful before time runs out. Comparison intensifies this pressure, making purpose feel competitive rather than fulfilling. But I am interrupts this restless striving with a deeper truth. Purpose does not originate from achievement. It flows from alignment. If God simply is, then purpose is not something created through effort alone. It is something revealed through relationship. This realization steadies the heart. Life no longer feels like a race to significance. Purpose becomes less about proving value and more about living in response to truth. When purpose becomes steady, it no longer fluctuates with success or failure. Setbacks do not erase meaning. Progress does not inflate identity. There is a growing clarity that purpose is not confined to a specific role or season. It is expressed through faithfulness, integrity, and obedience in the present moment. I am anchors purpose in the now. It removes the obsession with future validation and past regret. Attention shifts from chasing an ideal version of life to being fully present in the life that is unfolding. Purpose stops being postponed and starts being practiced. This shift also brings freedom from comparison. When purpose is grounded in presence, there is no need to measure progress against others. Each path is understood as unique, guided, and intentional. Competition fades, replaced by contentment and confidence. Steady purpose also brings endurance. When challenges arise, meaning does not collapse. Difficulty no longer signals misalignment. Instead, it becomes part of refinement. Purpose grows deeper, not weaker, through resistance. There is a resilience that emerges from knowing that presence remains constant, even when direction feels unclear. I am also transforms motivation. Actions are no longer fueled by fear of insignificance or desire for approval. They are shaped by conviction and trust. Work becomes an expression of alignment rather than a quest for identity. Effort becomes focused rather than frantic. As purpose steadies, impatience loosens its grip. There is less urgency to rush outcomes or force results. Timing is trusted. Growth is allowed to unfold. This patience is not passive, it is confident. It rests in the assurance that presence is already at work. Purpose grounded in I am also simplifies life. Decisions become clearer because they are filtered through alignment rather than ambition. There is less distraction, less fragmentation, and less inner conflict. Life begins to move with coherence instead of chaos. This steadiness does not make life predictable, but it makes it meaningful. Purpose becomes an undercurrent rather than a destination. It carries the heart through change without losing direction. And in this steadiness, peace and clarity grow together. When I am becomes the foundation, purpose no longer wavers with circumstance. It becomes rooted, resilient, and enduring. Life stops asking, "What must I achieve to matter?" and begins living the answer through presence and trust.